Installation and basic configuration of the Acronis cyber infrastructure. The first step is you'll need to download the ISO. To do that, you can log in to your partner account. Once logged into the partner account, at the top level, go to Settings, Locations, and you'll find Add Backup Storage. Clicking on this link will open a window with a link to the Quick Start Guide as well as the Administrator's Guide and download ISO link. Once you download this ISO image, you'll be able to deploy the Acronis cyber infrastructure onto your hardware or your virtual machine. Once you power on your machine, it will boot into the installer. This is the Acronis Cyber Infrastructure Installer. So once that has loaded, you're going to go through the setup wizard to begin the setup of the Acronis Cyber Infrastructure. The first thing you'll need to do is read and accept the end user license. You'll need to name your host. Make sure that you have your 2 network connections in place on 2 separate networks. Make sure that your network time is turned on and you're in the correct time zone. And at this point, if it is your first node in the cluster, you will say, yes, create new cluster. If once you have an existing cluster, you can say no, add to existing cluster, and it's going to require the IP address and the token. We already have one of our nodes set up, so we're going to go and take a look at that node here, and we can actually see the Add Node button. So by going into Infrastructure, Nodes, we have our first node already set up here. We can add node, and it's going to bring up a field with both our IP address and also a token. So this token is valid until the 14th of July. We're going to copy this token. If we go back over here and say no, next, it's already picked up the IP address of the management node because it has to be on the same network. So it knows there's a management node. If you have multiple clusters, you can actually choose which one. We have multiple clusters set up, but that is the correct one. We noticed from here. We can then input our token and click next. It's going to connect to the management node and validate that that is a valid token for adding another node to the network. Once that validation is complete, it's going to allow us to, from the hard drives, we can see we have a 120 gig hard drive for the operating system, and that'll leave us with 2 available for storage. If we wanted, at this point, if we had multiple hard drives we wanted to create a RAID mirror for our system disk, we can do that. But we should leave all of the other disks alone, and we will add those to the storage role in a minute. So we're going to go ahead and click next. Just a quick warning to say it's going to delete everything that's on those disks. Where I say go ahead. We're now going to create a password. And this is the root account used for administering the system. We just have to enter that password to make sure it's correct. And it is now going to go ahead and deploy that solution. And once it is deployed, that node is going to show up inside our cluster. There we go. We can actually see that second node is now in an installing state. And it's going to go ahead and finish that installation. And once that installation is complete, we'll move on to the next step. So all 3 nodes are now fully installed, and we're ready to actually start our cluster. So we're going to go in and select our first node and create a cluster. We're going to name our cluster. and create new cluster. So that's going to go ahead and create our cluster for us. That's going to take a couple of minutes to complete, but it's basically setting up all of the disks, and it should be assigning those. Now we can see we have, if we go back to our node, once it's done, we can see we've assigned a metadata role. The other two disks have been assigned to the storage. So we go back to our nodes. We can select another one, select our second node, and we can join that to the cluster. So we're going to go ahead and join the existing cluster. And at the same time, we'll pick our third node, and we'll also join that to the cluster. So it'll take a couple of minutes for all of that to happen. So the storage cluster has now been created. We now have 3 healthy nodes in our storage cluster. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at settings. So there's a couple of things we want to look at. First of all, we want to look at our Acronis Cyber Infrastructure license. So it's in trial mode right now. It's going to give us up to 1 terabyte of space. Other than that, there's no other limitations. Highly recommend that you, however, enable the service provider license agreement if you're using the Acronis Cyber Cloud and you're using the Acronis Cyber Infrastructure as an Acronis backup gateway. So it's a fairly straightforward process to do that. You need to register it with the Acronis Cyber Cloud. So we're going to go ahead and upgrade, use SPLA. We're going to choose our data center. In our case, it's US2 in Boston. Go ahead and activate. It's going to take us out to the Acronis Cyber Cloud. We're going to accept. We're going to end our trial and start using the license agreement, and we're going to click OK. So those nodes, because we were already signed in, remember we downloaded the ISO image earlier, so as a result, we're already signed in and we're good to go. So we now have the SPLA, and it will expire 2 weeks approximately in the future. That is a rolling 2 weeks. If I just click away for 1 second and click back, we'll now notice it says unlimited. So that is now managed entirely through the Acronis Cyber Cloud. Next thing I want to take a look at is the management node. So you'll notice that in the management node, we actually see that there are 3 nodes. We can go in and we can actually back up that management node if we want, because currently we only have the management, the little M here on this MKG1. But instead of doing a backup, we're going to actually select all 3 of these nodes, and we're going to create high availability. High availability allows you to, if one of those nodes is offline, manage the cluster from the other node. So we're going to go ahead and proceed. We now have to choose a virtual IP for the admin panel. So it needs to belong to the private network. So we'll do 10. And from the other network. So it's going to go ahead and reconfigure the high availability of the storage cluster, allowing us to access via a high available IP address. So we now have high availability set up. It shows us the nodes which are included in that cluster. So our metadata server is spread across, our management server is spread across, and we now have successfully set up high availability. Next thing we're going to do is go into the storage. We see under backup storage, we have 3 available nodes. So the first thing we're going to do is take a look at selecting a node, and then we can look at creating a gateway. So the first type of gateway we're going to look at is a network file system. So once you select the nodes, you're going to choose what type of storage on the back end, whether it is the local attached Acronis Cyber Infrastructure Cluster storage, a network file system, or public cloud. So the first one we're going to look at is network file system, which is why we've only selected one node. We're going to select the private and public interface. And now we're going to supply the host name or IP address and the export name. We can either choose to use NFS3 or NFS4. So it's going to verify our volume parameters. Looking at S3 compatible or cloud storage, we're going to actually select multiple nodes and add those to our backup gateway, providing us an extra level of redundancy because that is supported for public cloud. So in the case of public cloud, we now have 3 different nodes. We can see that the network and their IP addresses. Go ahead, and now we can select from some of the well-known solutions like IBM Cloud, Alibaba, Amazon S3, Google Cloud, or we can choose something like Auth v2 compatible, Auth v4 compatible S3, Microsoft Azure, Swift Object Storage, or even SoftLayer Swift. So once we select one of these clouds, we're going to see that the information below is going to change slightly. In the case of if we were to go to the compatible storage, it is important to know that we are not going to create the bucket. It has to be an already existing bucket. So you'd enter your endpoint, access key, your secret access key, and then specify the bucket that you would be using. And then you go ahead and hit next. It's going to validate that in the same way that it did for NSF. So the next step is to take a look at using the local cluster itself. Again, selecting the network. We're now going to be able to set the parameters for the volume. So this is based on the availability. We're going to use erasure coding at the host level with a 1+2 configuration. The other the other erasure coding options aren't available because of the number of hosts that we have in the system. We're going to go ahead and click next. And then the next thing we need to do is we need to specify a domain name. So this is going to be what your Acronis backup gateway domain name is. And so this does need to be a fully qualified domain name that resolves. So if we did something like backup.domain.com, it gives us an example here of what we need to create as far as the A records, as far as the settings there, and you would need to specify those at the root domain is managed. Once that is complete, you go ahead and you're going to register this backup gateway that we just created, whether it's an S3, NFS, or in this case, local attached storage. The process for the domain name and the registration is exactly the same. So we're going to go in and we're going to specify the account, and this is the account at the partner level. So that means looking at the partner level, this is where we can add backup storage. So if you don't have the add backup storage, the user either doesn't have enough permissions or you're at the wrong level in the organization. So we're going to use this particular user, which is, and we're going to specify the password. I'm going to go ahead and hit next. So it's going to go out and it's going to create that backup gateway for us. And I'm just going to register that gateway. So if we now go and we look here at the location, we can now see that the backup domain is here. So again, this would need to be a fully resolvable domain name. Obviously, in this case, it's just for demo purposes. So our backup gateway is set up, and we can go ahead from our Acronis Cyber infrastructure, and we can actually now see our backup gateway. So within the service provider account under locations, we do have some ability to make some changes. So we can take this, our backup domain, and we can, from here, we can provide a different name for it. It's not going to change the URL, but if you wanted to give it a different name so that it was easier to recognize, you can. We can also change which location it is in. So so you can reorganize these if you wanted to, and place them in a different location. You also have the ability for this location here, where these are organizational units that are simply a way of being able to visually represent how the backup locations are organized. You can, if you want, even add a location, or you can go in and edit a location simply by, so if you want, rename, and you could rename this as something different to make it easier, and now see that it is here, and I can move any of the backup that are not inherited. I can move those around. The inherited ones you will remain where they are. The way that they are organized becomes important when you're actually deploying new partners. So if I go here and I add a new partner or customer, I will be able to use that location. So I can choose which editions. Once I've chosen the editions, the next thing I will do is configure services. So under each of the services, one of the things I can choose is which backup locations are enabled. So in this case, we can see that those same headers here, and then the backup storage underneath them. So this will be visible, and it helps you to organize. So if you want to, you can change those names. From within a partner, once it has been created and that storage has been delegated to them, when you're creating a new customer, selecting the service, you can also go into configure, and we'll notice here that we have a drop-down menu. And based on that drop-down menu, I can choose then which actual storage location I want to use. Whether under Acronis, Google Cloud, or in this case, the one we just created. Once you've created an Acronis backup storage, you may from time to time want to take a look at the settings. You can certainly take a look at that. However, to change the redundancy, you'll need to contact support, as it can have a detrimental impact on performance. You will also find that there is a certificate which is used when connecting between the Acronis Cyber infrastructure through the Acronis Backup Gateway into the Acronis Cyber Cloud. That certificate is valid for about 1 year from the time it is issued. And prior to that certificate expiring, you will receive warnings saying that the certificate is out of date or becoming out of date. In which case, you can log in to your Acronis Cyber infrastructure, go to the backup storage, and update the certificate. This is simply going to ask you to log in to and connect to the backup storage software, to the Acronis cloud.acronis.com, using the same account that was used to originally set up the Acronis Backup Gateway. So we would use that same user and the same password, and we would create a new certificate. It will also be valid for 1 year. If you've made a mistake in creating the gateway and you have not yet actually backed anything up to that gateway, you are able to actually remove that gateway. If, however, you are if you've already stored backups on that gateway, if you remove the gateway, you will lose those backups. So it is important to make sure that you do not remove the gateway once backups are in place. And if you need to make changes, you go through the documentation and make sure you're doing those according to the proper method. You can, however, if you need to, you can add and remove nodes from a gateway. So you can choose a single node, and you can release that from the gateway, and it will remove that node. If you have available nodes that are not part of the gateway, and it is not an NFS gateway, which today only supports one node, you are able to go in and add them to the gateway. You follow through a limited version of the wizard to do that, just to make sure you're picking the correct networks, and it will add that back to the gateway. This is one way that you can actually upgrade the nodes that are in the gateway by adding additional nodes, adding them to the gateway, and then removing the older nodes. In order to delete or remove the gateway entirely, you would actually need to release all 3 nodes. And by doing so, you will actually remove the gateway in its entirety, and you would be able to set up a new gateway. That being said, you also need to go in and remove that from this location here. So it's important to do both of those. It is not a common scenario that you need to remove a gateway, but if it is required, that would be how it would be done. In this case, you can choose either a graceful or forced. It would be highly recommended you do a graceful release. Again, you'll need to provide your credentials. So we now have 3 available nodes, so we could now go in and create a new backup gateway from this.